All right. Let's go ahead and get started. Oh no, it won't let me. There we go. A lot of curveballs today.
Maybe
Hi.
something. Yeah, go
Yeah,
ahead.
no worries. Hi everyone. Welcome to our event today. Very sorry for the uh slight little change in plans we have here, but we really appreciate you joining. My name is Andy Morales, he, him. I'm a member of East Bay Democratic Socialists of America, and I'm the co-chair of our East Bay DSA Anti-Imperialism Committee. East Bay DSA has been collaborating with Mexico Solidarity Project to promote the nationwide speaking tour of Mexico Solidarity Project's very own José Luis Ceja Granados.
Let me interrupt. Can I interrupt you for a second? People need to put their cells on mute.
That's, I think, the airport again. Was that the airport? That might be.
Oh,
No,
it
I
might
was
have been.
calling
Okay, I
someone to
think
go
everybody
online.
should put
Yeah.
themselves on mute. It would be
Thank you,
good.
Vicky.
Sorry.
No, that's a good point. Thank you. I appreciate that. Uh, yeah, so East Bay DSA has been collaborating with Mexico Solidarity Project to promote the local stop, though for today it's going to be virtual, of the nationwide speaking tour of their very own Jose Luis Ceja Granados. Really appreciate you all being able to join today virtually. For those of you who don't know, there will also be hoping it should be, if everything continues as planned, a stop in San Francisco tomorrow night. I'm going to go ahead and post a link in the chat for those of you who are interested, if you want to come see him live tomorrow night, 6 p.m. Out in the Mission by 24th Street and Mission. Yeah. Before we get started, just to do a little bit of housekeeping. If you haven't signed in yet, please do so. I will go ahead and post that link in as well. It's eastbaydesa.us/anti-imp-sign-in. It's in the chat there, although it's not hyperlinked, but if you just copy paste it, you'll be able to get there. Also, please check out links for our co-sponsors for this event. We would absolutely love to have folks join our local DSA chapter and get involved in this and other international solidarity work and anti-imperialism work we've been doing. Not to mention all of the other important stuff we're doing in our socialist project. So going to post the East Bay DSA Zoom link. And last but definitely not least, Mexico Solidarity Project would also love your support. They've got some information on how you can get connected, and they've got this incredible bulletin that will keep you informed and updated on all things Mexico and Mexican politics. There's a lot for you to check out on there. I highly encourage it. I highly encourage you to sign up for that bulletin. Thank you, Jose Luis. Put in their link, and then there's the subscribe one just underneath if you want to jump on the bulletin there. All right, so let's get into this. We are very fortunate today to have Jose Luis join us, and very grateful for him being very flexible and being able to do this virtually still. A little bit about our guest before we have him take the floor. Jose Luis Ceja is a freelance writer and photojournalist based in Mexico City, focusing on contemporary and political issues, especially those that involve grassroots efforts to affect social change in Mexico and Latin America. He's currently finishing up a degree in human rights at UNAM, the Autonomous University of Mexico City. His Anti-Imperialista column appears monthly in the Mexico Solidarity Bulletin. Again, be sure to check out Mexico Solidarity Project's bulletin in the link that we posted just a moment ago. Jose Luis writes regularly for Venezuela Analysis and among many other publications, recently authored an article on Mexico's electoral reforms for the nation. An experienced speaker, he was a panelist on Mexico's economy at the March 2023 Burying 200 Years of the Monroe Doctrine conference. And he's also worked throughout Latin America as an election observation specialist, including a stint as a member of the Canadian Electoral Mission in the 2009 presidential election in El Salvador, and as an ethno-cultural outreach officer for Elections Canada for the 2011 federal election. More recently, he observed a 2018 presidential election in Mexico, where he was responsible for the English language communication strategy for the Scholar and Citizen Network for Democracy, an independent observation mission led by Dr. John Ackerman. He has been working on developing international solidarity with countries of the global south since his first visit to Venezuela in 2005, and he has since traveled to the country on several occasions to further develop ties with the people of Venezuela through the Norman Bethune Front. All right, so why don't we go to you, Jose Luis? Got a few questions prepared for today's talk. Figured we could start with that, and then after a bit, we could open up questions to the audience. But just to start things off, thank you so much for joining us. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little about what this tour has been about for you, like what your focus has been on, why you've been doing it, and why now, really.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks for that lovely introduction, and thank you everybody for adjusting to the circumstances of being here on Zoom. I was really hoping that we could meet in person. I will be in town and meant to fly out a little bit later today, so I'm sticking around in the airport here. But if not, I'm sure there'll be other opportunities for us to work together. So what's the thinking behind this tour? And Andy mentioned that I've been doing Venezuela solidarity work for a really long time, basically since 2005. I got really intrigued by seeing everything that was happening in Venezuela at the time, about in particular the explosion of mass participation, politics done from below. I think in particular when we think about a place like Venezuela, we often think about the big picture, right? Hugo Chavez, Nicolas Maduro, U.S. imperialism, the State Department, sanctions, et cetera, et cetera. But we often forget that that process has always been a citizen-led grassroots effort as well. And so when I think about the solidarity work that we were engaged in, we continue.
Can you try switching your mic again? It's been.
Is it getting scratchy?
Yeah. It's kind of hard to make it up.
Okay, is that better? Does that sound nice and clear for you?
That's a lot better. Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay, good. Sorry about that. Yeah, so when I think about reflecting on the Venezuela solidarity work that I've been engaged with, I think there came a moment where I started engaging in some self-criticism. It's what was the work we doing really being effective? And while I don't mean to besmirch that experience, I think it was very valuable in a lot of ways. Ultimately, we look at the situation of Venezuela today, and I think we can agree that the problem in that country is mostly driven by the power of U.S. imperialism to be able to exert its influence over Latin America the way that it does. And so, as someone who was born in Mexico and has been living and working in Mexico full time, I kind of thought about what can we do differently this time around. Andy mentioned I'm doing a thesis in a master's program, and it's actually basically about anti-imperialism. What does anti-imperialism look like in the 21st century? What's the role of these kind of transnational solidarity networks that we built over the years? And obviously, we can even go back further to the solidarity efforts with Chile, solidarity efforts with Central America, when we're talking about Latin America, right? And so when we started thinking about doing this tour, I realized that what we really needed to focus on was a place where we can intervene, given our limited capacity and resources, in a more kind of direct, serious way. And the way I kind of the conclusion I reached was that it's with you, it's with the people in this room. It's about strengthening the relationships with other leftists and activists and progressive-minded people to connect with you about different means that we can provide information that you need. It was mentioned that I work for Venezuela Analysis, and Venezuela Analysis has been around for 20 years. It's a really invaluable resource, right? But what else can we be doing? We just started the Mexico Solidarity Media website. So it's a bit, my elevator pitch is always, it's basically Venezuela Analysis, but for Mexico. So that's what we've been doing. Let's spend some energy. Let's create this website. I have some experience as a writer and an editor. I can share that experience and do that with you. What are different other ways we can do it? Intervening in our own political spaces, doing educationals. We did a couple of webinars before this. We did a couple of events. I'm just going to mute it.
Thanks, Jose. Yeah, we're dealing with the very real circumstances of airport announcers in the background. But thank you, Jose. We'll just give it a sec.
And so we arrived to this moment, which is like, okay, how does that actually get done? How do we convince people? How do we, have the difficult conversations if necessary that we need to have? And so we agreed we settled upon this idea of doing the speaking tour. So that's what this is about. And, just before we started the meeting, we were just having an informal chat. And, it's one thing to come here and share ideas and for people can ask me all the questions they want and I'll do my best to try to answer them, but also for me to learn, right? Like, what are the things that you are interested in hearing about? And then what can I do as a organizer to make that happen? I also think about the fact that I'm lucky in the sense that I have the privilege of being able to speak and write in English. So let's make that available. I lived many years in Canada, obtained Canadian citizenship, so that means that somebody like me can board a plane and come to the United States, which isn't actually true of many Mexicans, right? It can actually be quite difficult to get a visa. So let's put all of those kind of energies, all of those ideas into action. And that's what this is about. And to help people understand what's actually happening in Mexico, because, and I'll end on this point so we can get on to the next question, which is that there is a lot of misinformation. There's a lot of inappropriate, inaccurate framing about issues. And then there's also some outright lies. And that responds to the class interests that are at play. And, it's sometimes easy, I would say, to kind of write off what's happening in Mexico because it isn't as flashy, right? Hugo Chavez, it was a giant of a figure of a political man, and López Obrador obviously is a very important key leader for Mexico, and what he's been able to do is extraordinary if you put things into context, especially. But it's hard to make that sell, and it's such a shame because Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, Bolivia, all these countries that are going, profound political transformations, they're kind of far away. It's harder for us to feel close to them. And when it comes to Mexico, we quite literally share a border, right? We're neighbors, long, long history, shared culture, especially in the border regions. There are many, many USians living now in Mexico, and obviously many Mexicans also living in the United States. So what can we do to kind of bridge that divide? What can we do to help us better understand and be inspired by each other? One of the things that I always mention, I did a presentation a couple of days ago to a labor studies class, and I ended up by telling them, you know what, if you think about the elections that are happening here in this country, in the United States, not too long from now, and you look at the candidates, and if you're feeling disappointed that you have two, older white men who are running, basically doing a redo of the last election, who are very, very similar, especially when it comes to foreign policy in terms of their positions, and you feel like it's a daunting, maybe even insurmountable challenge in your mind to be able to defeat that duopoly that exists here in the United States. Well, that's how we felt in Mexico not too long ago. Before the election of López Obrador, we felt like that the challenge was immense. That would we be able to pull this off? And we did, right? I mean, in 2018, López Obrador was elected. In the Mexico Solidarity Project, we call it a watershed moment. There's a before and after, and everything changed after that election. We were able to, and sometimes when I stop to think about it, it's extraordinary, right? To defeat, a deeply entrenched, deeply corrupt, deeply violent political regime in Mexico. There are different circumstances in each country, right? But if you think about how things worked in Mexico, to actually be able to do that, to be able to install a new kind of political regime, to see that this slogan that López Obrador used continuously, that por el bien de todos, primero los pobres, for the good of all, the poor come first, to actually see that implemented, put into practice, to see 9 million people lifted out of poverty, to see a renewed investment in the poorest parts of the country, to see the state playing an active role in the economy, to see the redistribution of the country's resource wealth directly into the pockets of the nation. I think that can be inspiration. I think precisely because it's inspirational, because people could take it as a model for them to continue to do the very important work here inside the belly of the beast, that you hear this bad framing. That's why you hear these lies. And again, I'll end on this, right? There was just this report. We'll get into it more in detail hopefully later, but where a number of outlets tried to basically launch a smear campaign against López Obrador in the context of the election to try to make it seem like it's tied to organized crime. It's ludicrous for a whole host of reasons. right? But these kinds of things are happening because they know of the power of that example. They know that for the working class at a global level, right, an advancement for the working class in Mexico represents an advancement for the working class everywhere, but especially at your doorstep, that can really undermine some of the pillars that this whole system of oppression is built upon inside the United States. And so I'm really glad to be able to share this time with you and to have these kinds of conversations to figure out how we can keep doing it and do it better.
Thank you so much, Jose Luis. And I definitely want to get into there are a lot of threads to follow there, and I definitely want to hear a lot more in a bit on why the U.S. has been reacting the way that it has, what those smear campaigns have looked like, both like within Mexico and over here. But maybe before we get into that, I'm wondering if it would help the audience to hear a little bit more about what this is all like really meant specifically for the Mexican people, the AMLO presidency. So I'm wondering if you could tell us a bit about, and by the way, for those of you who do not know, Mexico's current president, who was inaugurated in 2018, is Andrés Manuel López Obrador, AMLO, known affectionately as AMLO. But I'm wondering, Jose Luis, can you tell us a bit about the AMLO presidency? What has changed in Mexico under AMLO? How has this affected the Mexican working class people? And what has this meant for Mexico's overall politics?
It's interesting because sometimes if you read mainstream coverage of Mexico, there is foreign correspondence. In fact, there's one case that comes to mind immediately. He's a Dutch journalist. He's actually the representative for the Committee to Protect Journalists in Mexico. His name's John Albert Hudson. And he goes around telling the whole world that Morena, López Obrador, his party, Claudia Sheinbaum, who's going to be the candidate in the upcoming elections on June 2nd, they are right-wingers disguised as leftists, right? It's extraordinary to come across that kind of framing, and it's actually somewhat consistent. And we can get into the reasons why, but that is inaccurate to say the least. And why is it inaccurate? Because if it boils down to anything, the lives of the Mexican working class, the campesinos, the poor, the youth, women, all of the constituencies in that we as leftists, know that are important to reach and to try to be win over to our ideas and to our political projects, their situation has improved, and it's indisputable, right? And it's improved because of the decisions that are made at the top. If we could kind of classify the previous regime, I often call it l'ancien regime, right? The old regime. It was, especially since the 80s, since the elections of de la Madrid, Carlos Salinas de Gortari, right? Cedillo, Fox, Calderón, Peña Nieto. So we're talking about decades. There was a very firmly established neoliberal consensus in this country. Either whether it was the pre in power or the pan, over the last 30 years, they pursued a very faithful application of the Washington consensus. And hopefully it's a term that people know, but in case they don't, right? Like, this idea that there should be less direct intervention in the state in favor of the majority population. Instead, it should be there to facilitate the entry of foreign direct investment, favor the interests of resource extraction, a reprimarization of the economy, the idea that you should deindustrialize and actually focus on the export of goods where you have a comparative advantage, et cetera, right? So this idea that we can kind of frame in this way, which is that in the global division of labor, the place of Mexico and Mexicans was this place of cheap resources and cheap labor. And, there were policies implemented to make that the case, to make it so that if there was direct investment, it was lured in by lucrative kind of tax deals where they would pay very low taxes, or they would set up in these maquiladora zones where there's basically no labor protections, et cetera. And that came from the very top, right? And it went all the way to the bottom. What does López Obrador represent? It means a break with that, right? A very different kind of governing, and governing for the majority of the country, of making decisions that favor that. Obviously, it's a multi-class project. I wouldn't go so far to say that Morena is, a Marxist party that is exclusively led by the working class. That's not the case. But it is definitely one where the representation of the interests of the working class play a predominant role. And so that is reflected in the policies of the government. And I think that's the part that I think really matters in terms of this conversation that I'm trying to have with people on the left. What else can we say about the government? Certainly there's like the metrics. We can talk about the rescue of the state oil company. Many of you in the United States will be familiar, right? Anything that was state owned is kind of deliberately left to rust, left to wither away. So you have the excuse that, oh, well, the only option now is to privatize it, right? That was the strategy when it came to key sectors of the economy, like oil extraction, like mineral extraction, like the electricity generation in the country. Under the guise of a transition to green energy, there was mass privatization of electricity generation in the country, which resulted in higher fees, not just for individuals, but for companies, making life more expensive. Now, quite the opposite is happening, right? There is also, I think, a reemergence of this understanding of the place of a welfare state, that there should be direct supports for people, that instead of these kind of very technocratic, specific kind of social programs that are only aimed at, oh, we'll support you just for long enough so that you can, quote unquote, get out of poverty. And in some ways, we can say that those were effective in a very kind of limited way. There's now a different kind of philosophy. The philosophy is universal social programs, right? The idea that everybody is eligible to receive the benefits of these programs. Just to name a few, I'll speak personally. I'm a student, and at the presentation that I did with the students, it was amazing to see their faces when I told them the following. I was like, I don't pay a penny in tuition. I don't pay a cent, and that, you know, not even you know, those user fees that sometimes they sneak in there, even in public institutions. But not only that, I'm paid a stipend. I'm paid a wage to focus on my studies on a full-time basis. 14,000 pesos a month. That's actually a really good wage, you know. That's almost enough to sustain my family. You know, I make a little bit of money on the side doing my work, of course, but it shows the commitment to the population in that sense, to make education accessible. How do you make education accessible? Not only do you make it free, but you actually support people so that they don't have to balance a job and going to school at the same time. That's one example. And the other one that comes to mind would be the pensions for seniors. So they get a bi-monthly pension, which is not a lot of money, right? But it's universal, it's guaranteed. Everybody who signs up for it can receive it. You know, there's even been instances of really notorious critics of the government lining up to go and collect their pension, and they should, right? Like, it's, you know, we can say it in kind of a tongue-in-cheek way, but that's their right. That's the way we approach things, and that's the way this government has been approaching things, and it's extraordinarily popular. You know, somewhere they calculate that upwards of 80%, but maybe between 70 and 80% of Mexican households benefit from at least one social program. So that is to say that there's a senior who collects a pension, or there's a student, or there's a campesino who's, you know, participating in the Sembrando Vida program, where they pay people to stay in their communities and plant trees. That's also a climate change mitigation effort, et cetera, et cetera. So there's so many different kinds of ways that these programs are reaching people now. And that also kind of helps us understand why he's extraordinarily popular. If you ask somebody who's unfamiliar with Mexico and maybe only reads what comes in the New York Times or the LA Times, or even progressive outlets, it was extraordinary to read in the Texas Observer, this like interview with this far right, well, not far right, right wing commentator named Tony Payan, and they kind of tried to sell it to you as if he is a progressive. You know, in this magazine that historically has played a positive role. Well, you would think that López Obrador is this awful authoritarian who hates human rights and democracy, and it's a total backslide in terms of all the progress that Mexico had made recently. And it's just not true, right? He's extraordinarily popular. In fact, he's so popular, maybe this could lead into our next question, but he's so popular that the successor candidate, so López Obrador, is constitutionally limited to only one term. And, you know, there's even some people who are like, oh, he's going to change the constitution so he can run again. He didn't, he won't. He's going to go retire. He said as much. I think he should be believed when he says, you know, he's older. He's ready to retire. He said it many times. His successor candidate, so the party chose a candidate. You'll often read that it's his hand-chosen candidate. That's not true. Is Claudia Sheinbaum. Claudia Sheinbaum is a former mayor of Mexico City. She was López Obrador's Secretary of the Environment when he was mayor of Mexico City himself. Mayor is kind of a misleading term. Like, Mexico City is so huge that it's more like a state, like a city state. Anyway, so it kind of has that level of government. She comes from the student movement. She actually won a Nobel Prize as a result of being on the IPCC on climate change. A doctorate. She's an engineer, an extraordinary candidate, really a great resume. But what I'm getting at is that she's also benefiting from that popularity. Yeah, I'll be honest, she's not a particularly charismatic woman. She's very, very intelligent. It's quite striking when you have a conversation or see her in interviews. You can tell this is somebody who really knows what she's talking about. But even all that, she is polling in the worst case scenario, 20 points ahead of her rival, and in the best one above 30. Right? There was one poll from De Las Heras that put her at 67% support. Right? I mean, maybe it'll hold, but that's extraordinary. Lopez Obrador won with slightly above 50%. If let's say she secures 60%, she will win a landslide election. And that's a bit of the danger. That's a bit of the reason why I'm also doing this tour, because it's going to be such a big victory that really the only hope that the opposition has right now is to try to delegitimize the election, to try to undermine credibility and faith in the Mexican election in order to subsequently try to, in a sense, try to pull up a coup. And that's the danger that we're at. But, that's a task that, we will have to confront in the future. But I do think that there's a really important place for international solidarity under those circumstances. I think that's actually where the support of the population in the places like the United States, because no coup happens in Latin America without the approval of the State Department, to actually be able to resist that, to ensure that the will of Mexican voters is actually reflected in the end result. And if that is the case, then we're going to see Claudia Sheinbaum, the first woman president of Mexico, come June 2nd.
Thank you so much, Jose Luis. So I guess there are a couple ways we could do this. I have some questions prepared. I really do want to get to Vicky's question at some point. I'm kind of trying to figure out, you mentioned that there was kind of a natural lead in to the next question. Were you thinking of the one that you saw in the chat, or the other questions, Jose? Go for the chat?
Yeah, we can go with that. Yeah, let's play it by ear.
Cool.
Let's keep it nice and loose.
Yeah,
so maybe we should read it out in case somebody sees it. Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah. So Vicky writes, what about this time and place allowed AMLO to be elected? What did he and Morena do right?
So that's a fantastic question, because it's important to figure out, I talked about taking inspiration. So I think it's important to know how we got there. So López Obrador comes onto the national scene actually as a result of his activism. There's a very famous photo of him bleeding from the ear because he was attacked by state security forces during a protest in his home state of Tabasco. And that's when everybody kind of starts paying attention. He grows in national prominence. Anyway, eventually in the year 2000, he's elected mayor/governor of Mexico City. And he makes a lot of changes, and it becomes his national profile obviously also gets raised as a result. Often they say that the mayor of Mexico City, Jefe de Gobierno, is the second most important political post in the country. So much so that it actually wasn't directly elected for a really long time. It was appointed by the president. So he wins in an election back when it was, or now that there was free and fair elections. And he runs for president in 2006. And we in the left in Mexico, we understand that he won. So he won in 2006, but there was an electoral fraud. So the election is stolen, despite the fact that there are mass protests and really, really good grassroots organization. The fraud is consolidated, and Felipe Calderón is actually able to secure his place in the presidency. And that's due to a lot of factors, which I don't think we have a lot of time to get into now. But I do mention it because, we talk a lot about the security issue that's happening in Mexico right now as we speak. It's a problem that actually began in 2006 under Felipe Calderón's presidency. And a lot of people forget the fact that one of the reasons he launched this so-called war on cartels was to shore up that legitimacy, because he was widely viewed by at least half of the population of Mexico as an illegitimate president. He was like, well, what kind of move can I make that will get me to win me some legitimacy? Well, nothing brings a country together like war, and that's true in Mexico as it is in the United States. And so that's part of what. So anyway, unfortunately, Calderón consolidates, but he becomes the key opposition figure in Mexico on the parliamentary left, because obviously there is a left in this country that doesn't really directly engage with elections, and if it does, it's more on a propaganda kind of effort as opposed to actually thinking that the strategy is winning state power. For those of us that agree with the strategy of taking state power, winning the government, he was the key figure. Then the 2012 election comes around. He also runs and he loses again. In this case, as a result of tons of illegal campaign financing, really, quite literally buying votes, especially in the state of Mexico, which has the largest electoral role. And unfortunately, we see the same result. Peña Nieto consolidates, wins, and actually something really important happens during his presidency. Very shortly after he wins, he signs something that's called the Pacto por México, or the Pact for Mexico, where the three major parties, the PRI, his party, the PAN, which had previously ruled the two previous governments, and even the PRD. The PRD is a left-wing party that emerged out of the protest movements within the PRI in the 80s as the home of the parliamentary left, but it gets consumed by the establishment. And the people in charge of the party decide that it's more convenient for them to kind of negotiate their access to power, and they sign this Pact for Mexico. And so after that, there's a situation that there's a phrase that I like that is often used, which is that the left became orphaned. There was no home for the left in that moment after 2012. It's like, do we really want to stay with this party that is basically signed a neoliberal pact that is no longer really representative of that kind of push for the democratization of society and the economy, that has kind of abandoned its values? And so people leave. The PRD kind of becomes an empty vessel, and Morena is founded as a movement. It's a movement first. There's a Congress, and they come together and they create. It's actually an acronym, Movimiento Renovación Nacional, or National Regeneration Movement. And after a couple of years, they pose to the rank and file of the organization, should we become a political party in order to run in the next election in 2018, or well, actually the midterm elections, but should we become a political party and continue that? And they agree, and actually becomes what's called a movement party. Now, it has become somewhat bureaucratized. It tends to happen in many left-wing parties, even in the best of circumstances. But it's still, nonetheless, it's in its constitution. It's meant to be a movement party. What happens in 2018? I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that the Pact por Mexico proved that something else needed to come around, that, the PRI had ruled for nearly 70 years uninterrupted. Then the PAN has two governments, and they were worse still. The PRI actually comes back in 2012, and it's one of the most corrupt, one of the most backwards kinds of governments, really kind of, despite the promises of, this is a new PRI, and we're not going to be like we were before. A lot of everything that we've seen before, there were all kinds of corruption scandals. And then obviously the security situation as well. People became totally disillusioned with the establishment parties. And, sometimes people, I'm critical of this language, is anti-establishment language, that, López Obrador is a populist and all this kind of stuff, because I think it's inaccurate. But I do think that in a lot of ways he was elected because he was seen as a not establishment party. Now, obviously he was, very present in the national life for a very long time, but he wasn't a member of those parties. He was always kind of, marginalized by them. During the 2016 election, there was a really famous smear campaign against him where countless ads were run that said, López Obrador is a danger for Mexico, right? And so suddenly in that moment, in 2018, so much disillusionment with the existing parties, so much discontent in terms of the corruption, so much discontent because of the security situation. They say, even people that probably don't form part of his base say, I'm going to vote for him. It's time for something else. And he wins that landslide election, which is actually really important. In the intro, it was mentioned that I served as an election observer in that election. We were worried. We were worried that there would be another fraud, that there would be another effort to prevent him from actually winning the presidency. But the enthusiasm for his candidacy was so big. It's kind of a crude analysis, but in an election fraud, like the actual, subterfuge that happens when you try to pull off a fraud, people often think about ballot box stuffing, but like the vote buying and all this kind of stuff, you can steal around 4% of the vote. And López Obrador's victory was so big that even if they had run a perfect fraudulent effort, it wasn't enough, right? The will of the voters was so overwhelming, the turnout was so high, and the voting for Morena, down the ballot as well, because they also won a majority in the Congress, was that it wasn't enough, even a fraud wouldn't have been able to stop it. That was the mood in the country. It happens more frequently than you realize. And I'll end on this. I was in an election observation effort in 2021 in Honduras. And I remember getting off the plane and, like every journalist, start chatting with the taxi driver, right? And as I'm talking to him and the way that he was talking, it reminded me so much of Mexico in 2018. I was like, this is the same mood. This country is ready for change. It doesn't matter. Like, he was telling me, he's like, I voted for the right-wing party in Honduras my whole life, called the National Party. I've Nacionalista my whole life, and my whole family is, and nobody in my family is voting for them this time around because of their circumstances. I won't get into it. But the point is that I remember getting to and meeting the rest of the team that was going to do the election observation effort. I was like, this is Mexico in 2018. It's the same. I can feel it. I can tell you this is what's going to happen. And sure enough, that's what happened, right? There was a confluence of very important factors that made it so that it was nearly unstoppable. Obviously, it also took a lot of organization. Morena has millions of members who do the work, the trabajo de hormiga, we say in Spanish, the ant work. I think we were trying to figure out how to say that in English, and we didn't quite figure it out, but there was a couple of terms out there that make sense. But to go out there, convince your neighbors, to knock on doors, to work at the polling booth and supervise the election, to put up posters in your community, to whatever, right? To post on social media, this kind of mood of doing the work, doing what's necessary. And I think in a lot of ways, what's happening now with before us, now in 2024, with these elections is similar. They're like, what do we need to do to not just, make sure that, this project continues, but how do we deepen the transformation? So the stakes are actually interesting for Morena. It's not, are they going to win? Because it's actually pretty clear if you look at the polls, unless something really dramatic happens, which doesn't look like it will, especially because the opposition has a really bad candidate, like even just kind of like a poli-sci analysis, like she's not a good candidate. She's not very good on the campaign trail. She makes gas all the time. She's not a very compelling figure. So the stakes aren't, are they going to win? The stakes is, how much are we going to win? Are we going to get enough votes so that we can get a supermajority in the Congress and start to make constitutional reforms, start to revert some of those neoliberal reforms that happened in the previous decades? One of the major challenges that's kind of limiting the ability for Morena to implement its project is actually the judicial branch of government. How can we win enough votes so that the judicial branch of government is no longer that impediment? Like just recently, as an example, they reverted one of the laws that was approved to help renationalize the energy sector in the country, saying that, nope, the Constitution, and it's in a sense, the Constitution says that we have to preserve competition, which means that not even state monopolies are allowed to exist. Okay, fine. If that's the way you're interpreting the Constitution, so be it. But let's change the Constitution back, right? But what do we need to do to get to that position? How do we win enough support to be able to do that without having to ask any favors or do any kind of political wheeling and dealing with the opposition, so that we can do it with the people that are elected come June 2nd?
Thank you, Jose Luis. I've actually got quite a few questions in the chat here. I'm going to go with one more I've got prepared, and then I'll hop to some of the audience questions, and then maybe I'll loop in some of the other ones that I've got as well. But yeah, before jumping into some of the ones that are in the chat, I just wanted to ask, what has the AMLO presidency meant for Mexican labor? What has changed since his inauguration? And what, if anything, what does this also mean for U.S. labor back home?
Yeah, absolutely. So I always like to answer that question by saying that for me, there's no doubt this is the most labor-friendly government in 40 years in Mexico. Mexico's complicated because even though the PRI very much today is like a center-right neoliberal party, kind of went through phases, and there was definitely a period where it was like a nationalist, developmentalist kind of political party, and it was very labor-friendly, especially shortly after the Mexican Revolution in the early 20th century. But the way I kind of frame it is the following. So you had basically a corporatist model, which proposed the following: workers, bosses, the state coming together and agreeing to give workers no real democratic representation. So these are kind of like, they're corporatist unions, company unions, you could call them, but they got good contracts. So they were able to get good wages. They were able to benefit from government social programs to help them access housing and things like that. And so for a while, that kind of worked. Obviously, there was always dissent, and there's always been the the more militant democratic unions. But eventually, that pact stops being sustainable because what developed was a situation where you had no democracy, so no ability to democratically change your leadership or vote on a new contract, and you also had really bad contracts. So the whole system kind of starts to fall apart, and it's been falling apart for the last few decades. But it ultimately kind of reaches this crisis moment, especially with the effort to destroy the Mexican electricity workers under Felipe Calderon's government, or the effort to really harm the teachers union, which is again one of the more militant unions. During Peña Nieto's government, there's a really famous moment where the federal police come and they totally clear out the Zócalo, the big public square at the heart of Mexico City, where the teachers were protesting with great amounts of violence. And so, they come to this moment of having to renegotiate this pact, but also, under different circumstances now. One key thing is the USMCA. So labor leaders in Mexico, Canada, the United States understood that one of the things that was weakening the power of labor in North America specifically was this race to the bottom. This threat that you could always offshore your production to Mexico where wages are cheap, where there aren't really workers' protection and all this kind of stuff. So there was definitely an understanding that the labor movements in each of the countries needed to include provisions in the new trade agreement that would actually facilitate the uplifting of workers. And so there's some very specific provisions inside the USMCA that protects workers' rights. There's something called the rapid response mechanism, which is kind of a novelty, which allows for movements, labor unions in any country to actually make a petition to another state to intervene. So if there's a US company that's producing in Mexico and it's engaging in strike breaking, you can make a petition, and the USMCA has mechanisms and tons of funding to try to. Now, in practice, it hasn't worked out that well. I think a lot of trade unions will tell you that they just get a slap on the wrist, and that's not good enough. But at least it's there. The other thing would be on May 1st, 2019, a very comprehensive labor reform is passed in Mexico, and that reform is overwhelmingly pro-labor. The idea is to bring back the democracy into the trade union movement in Mexico, to make it so if you have a contract, it has to be ratified by the workers in a supervised vote. So you can't, engage in ballot stuffing. If you have a leadership, that leadership has to be democratically approved. And if it isn't, then you lose your certification. And then you've also seen this emergence of the independent trade union movement, which is working to reorganize some of these, to push out those company unions and bring in authentic worker representation there. Again, once you get into the details, it all sounds really nice, but the details are a little bit trickier, right? But that's the task of the labor movement, to actually do what you can with what's available to you. And I think you're going to continue to see more and more organization from these democratic unions, more and more workers signing up to them, and also that that cross-border solidarity. There were a number of incidents where there were protests in favor of these independent unions in Mexico happening in the United States. And I know that there was a lot of trade unions leadership in particular who were really excited by what they saw from the UAW strikes, right? And so there's kind of this idea that an injury to one is an injury to all, and actually putting that into practice in the context of North America.
That was great. Thank you. You know what? Sorry, folks. I'm going to ask one more question here that I've got prepared, and then I want to jump to Peter's question, which is about U.S.-Canada Mexico agreement. But before jumping there, I did want to quickly ask this one more. How has the AMLO presidency affected U.S. political relations with Mexico? What has changed in American foreign policy with Mexico since AMLO has taken office?
So I would say that one of the pillars of the fourth transformation, which is what the process here in Mexico is called, briefly, why is it called the fourth transformation? Well, Mexico has gone through previous ones: the independence struggle, the reform period under Benito Juarez, which pushed out the French intervention here in Mexico, the Mexican Revolution, and then this. And the idea is kind of like transforming public life, right? That, like, to that degree, and there's a deliberate effort to tie what's happening now to those historical moments in Mexico. And I think that's also really important to keep in mind when we think about what's happening in the country. This idea that this is a continuation of those radical, profound transformations happening. I'm a fan of that slogan, the fourth transformation. I'm a fan of linking to that historical memory, that memoria histórica, as we say in Spanish. So one of the key things of the fourth transformation is the defense of sovereignty. In fact, in my studies, I talk a lot about the defense of sovereignty and its role in the promotion of human rights. In fact, I say la defensa de la soberanía es la protección de derechos humanos. By that I mean is for us to see the full spectrum of human rights, not just the negative rights, not just like, freedom of expression and freedom of association, political rights, all these kind of things, but the positive rights, the right to housing, the right to education, the right to an access to culture, et cetera, et cetera. That's only possible if you can actually exercise your sovereignty, right? That you say, we are in a sovereign country and we're going to make our decisions our way, free of interference, and be able to fulfill that. Concretely, what does that mean? That means rescuing the state oil company to say, we have a monopoly on the extraction and production of oil in this country. We're going to sell that oil and we're going to use it to redistribute wealth to the population, either through the cash transfer programs, but also expanded access to healthcare, expanded access to education, et cetera, right? And so if you think about sovereignty and you think about the bilateral relationship, well, it naturally does lead to tension, right? The United States is an imperialist power in the world, and it does not respect sovereignty. I think that is very evident if we're watching the news lately. We just saw them bomb 85 sites all over the Middle East. It doesn't respect sovereignty. But the thing is that the difference with López Obrador, the difference with this government, is that the previous regimes were comfortable with the US stepping on our sovereignty. They would be like, well, okay, I guess we'll open up our oil sector to you. Oh, I suppose that we'll do your dirty work in Central America, et cetera, et cetera. And so what you're seeing in this case is saying, no, we will defend this. If you read like the call outs of the conversations that happened between the presidents, be it Biden or Trump before him, or unfortunately probably Trump after him, you will see that, no, it's a good relationship, we're friends, et cetera, et cetera. Quite literally, Trump and López Obrador call each other friends. The relationship is very positive. And even if it wasn't, they would say it is, because the relationship is so close, because we need each other for a lot of kind of strategic reasons, but also like the economies these days since 1994, but even beforehand, but especially since the free trade agreement, they're deeply integrated. Supply chains require smooth production in Mexico to make it so that just-in-time deliveries actually happen, and they're able to be able to bring products to the market, et cetera, et cetera. But also, if we're just going to be sincere, no, the relationship now is fine, but there are points of tension, right? López Obrador's energy policy is a point of tension. The independent foreign policy that Mexico adopts towards Latin America is also a point of tension. I will give one really clear example that I actually use all the time. I'll give two. The first one is Cuba. So not too long ago, there was talk about the Department of the Treasury possibly leveling sanctions against Mexico, against Pemex specifically, for selling oil to Cuba. Cuba used to, had access to Venezuelan oil, but Venezuela, because of their own blockade that's been imposed on that country, doesn't have the ability to do that anymore. And that's generating a lot of economic troubles for people in Cuba. And in fact, López Obrador is very close to Díaz-Canel, the Cuban president. In fact, he won a medal because of his defense of Cuba. But there was a great exchange at one of López Obrador's morning press conferences where he says, even in these words, let it be clear once and for all, we don't have to ask anybody permission to sell oil to Cuba. Cuba is a dignified, strong people, and if they want our oil, we will sell it to them. Let it be clear, right? No, so no room for doubt. And that is the exercise of sovereignty, to say that, go ahead, threaten us with sanctions. This is important to us. We're going to keep doing it because that's what a sovereign country does. I can't possibly ever imagine somebody like Peña Nieto or Felipe Calderón taking that position. And that does irk people, right? The Cuban constituency in Florida is very, very powerful. They're very influential, and it makes people in the State Department angry, but they have to deal with it, right? Too bad. that is the reality of having a government that prioritizes the defense, the protection of a country's sovereignty. The other example I would give is in the case of Venezuela. So do you remember not too long ago, Juan Guaido declaring himself president of Venezuela? Well, there was a very deliberate strategy there. So that was actually planned ahead, weeks ahead. It wasn't a surprise to the people involved. And that's why you saw so many governments declare that they now recognize Guaido over Maduro, especially from Latin America, right? So this would have been Duque in Colombia, what's his name in Chile, anyway, Sebastián Piñera. All of them came out very quickly saying, "Oh, we recognize Guaido," and you know who didn't? López Obrador, right? Very, very quickly that morning. I was watching because I'm a follower of Venezuela. Watching as everything was happening, I was like, "Oh boy, like I don't know what's going to happen here, right? Like this looks bad. This is a very serious threat to the Bolivarian revolution." And then Mexico says that, and then there's an announcement. It actually comes from Jesus Ramirez Cuevas, who's his communications head. And that intervention, the fact that it was fast, I also think was really important. Why? Because that momentum, that narrative that they were trying to sell the world, no, there's a consensus. Even Latin America, even Maduro's neighbors no longer recognize them. It throws it in its tracks. And I think that, obviously also the role of the Venezuelan people in rejecting that coup, but diplomatically at the international level, López Obrador, the Mexican government, and the Mexican government has a lot of diplomatic weight in the region, saying, we're not going to play this game. We do not recognize Guaido. Who is this guy? Our relationship is with Maduro. I think really helped to kind of keep that from being consolidated. I don't know what would have happened. It doesn't really make a lot of sense to speculate, but I like to think that that helped stop that from consolidating, and that actually kept Guaido from actually being able to exercise any real power in Venezuela. That's the importance of sovereignty, and that's a very clear example of how the foreign policy under López Obrador has changed, and it does ruffle feathers. And I think that's a big thing. And then finally, and I wanted to enter this kind of independently, which is the issue of migration. So let's get into that maybe later. Maybe that can be the next question. So I'll jump in, Andy, if you don't mind. So Isaac Harris, is that okay? Can we do the, yeah, okay. Can you talk about the AMLO government's response to migrants coming through Mexico, specifically how the National Guard, created to address violence, has been tasked mostly to apprehend migrants? So what happened with the migration? I think anytime I talk about this, we should be front and center. Many of the policies by the federal government in Mexico towards migrants are reprehensible. There is clearly not a prioritization of the protection of the human rights of migrants, the right to migration, and all of that. Why is it happening? I think it's important to contextualize it. I'm not trying to justify it because I think that would be irresponsible of me. What happened was Donald Trump is in power, and obviously we know the role of being anti-migrant plays in his whole political project. He openly threatens Mexico, and the details of it eventually emerge, but basically saying, you're going to do what we want when it comes to slowing the flow of migration, or we're going to impose these tariffs on you. And these tariffs are going to keep increasing until you do what we say. So basically trying to extort a country. And then that calculation, what does the government say? Those kinds of taxes would have totally derailed Mexico's economy. It's so oriented towards exporting to the United States that those kinds of tariffs would destroy the economy. It would probably push it into recession. And I imagine that what happens is they made a calculation. It's like, are we going to throw away our political project? It took us so long to finally win an election and reach this point. Are we going to, sacrifice that under these circumstances by standing up to Trump? So they decided they don't, right? They make the decision, we're going to have to play the game. And they do. And they start doing a lot of the contention efforts to try to keep the flow of migration lesser or keep it into the Mexico southern states, et cetera, et cetera. So to specifically answer your question, that's what happens. I don't know if they're mostly used to apprehend migrants, but they are used to apprehend migrants. The National Guard is used as the state security force to control migration through the country. That very much happens. And it's done for that reason, to appease a government that is far more powerful, geopolitically speaking, but also militarily, to do what they were requesting Mexico to do, which is control the actual flow of migration north, right? Because it's not even, I don't want to get too much into the migration because that's not what this event is about, right? But like the issue around the US southern border is not so much about um, migration and people actually, crossing over and things like that. What it really is about is denying them the ability to be able to actually reach the country so that they're not in a position to ask for asylum in the first place, to find different creative ways. And we know during the pandemic, they used Title 42, for example, to quite literally stop meeting their international obligations. Ultimately, that's the issue. And I think that's always important to really, really highlight that. The migration issue basically disappears if the US meets its international obligations to migrants. It doesn't, right? It would require an investment in more facilities and more judges, justices to actually evaluate the case, all this kind of stuff. That's not happening. It doesn't look like it's going to happen. And so the alternative that policymakers in Washington do is try to put pressure so they don't make it in the first place. That's what this whole CBP1 app thing is. The idea is that the only people who can make it through are the people who make an appointment, and therefore it's regulated and controlled. But anyway, to go back to Mexico, there are reasons why this is happening. I think when we think about, I opened this conversation with a talk about, building transnational solidarity networks, and I think in the border region, you see a lot of collaboration and coordination between migrant organization activists, advocates, but it doesn't actually happen as much as you think it does in the centers of power. So why do I say that? I cover migration a lot in my journalism, in my writing, and I actually engage with a lot of the activists. And I was like, how close are you to people in the United States, right? Like, because I tell them the same thing I just finished telling you, which is this issue becomes more manageable if the US meets its international obligations. Like, what are your strategies to make that happen? And that's not happening, right? That's not actually happening as much as I think it needs to actually be effective on this issue. So anyway, so that brings us to the reality that is before us. The other thing I would say is that it's important to highlight that the treatment of migrants by state officials and state security forces doesn't have to be the way it does. That could change. It could change almost immediately, to send an order down from the top to be like, stop violating their human rights, right? Stop detaining them the way that you are. Stop stuffing them into dangerous facilities, right? I'm of the thinking that honestly, migration should just flow the way that it does, right? I live in Mexico City and quite close to the northern bus terminal. And the northern bus terminal is a kind of a departure point for a lot of migrants. So a bunch of camps ended up developing, a bunch of improvised camps. And, there was a lot of tension between people who live in that area and the migrants, and, because they're not sanitary conditions, and there's often a language barrier, so there's a lot of tension that does emerge in these circumstances, right? Like we should there's no reason. Mexico has enough resources at its disposal, certainly in the capital, the richest part of the country, to provide dignified conditions for these migrants, and they're not doing it. And I think that's a task for us in Mexico to continue to pressure the government and whatever decision makers at the local level, federal level, so that changes immediately. And I think that is something that, to our shame, we haven't been able to successfully do.
Thank you, Jose Luis. And actually, given that we went in that direction, are you okay if we ask some questions that are still related to this, or do you want to? Okay. Yeah, I am curious. Could you talk a little bit about some of the more recent developments with Texas, just what's been happening at the border there, what that's meant for U.S. politics, for the Mexican people, the Mexican government? Yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, it's been kind of really sad to see how it's been playing out in the United States. It seems like all of the attitudes and discontent that emerged when people were seeing children in cages, most of that desire to see that situation change seems to have evaporated. I mean, I don't think that it's gone, but it's obviously, I think many of the xenophobic thinking has won the day. especially in these border communities. It plays a really important role in domestic U.S. politics in the way that reproductive rights do, right? It's used by the Democrats to try to win an election. It's used by the Republicans to try to win their elections as well, to say like, no, we're tougher on the border. The border is a key issue, it looks like, in the United States right now, leading into the election. So a lot of it responds to domestic policies, and whatever the Texas governor is doing has to do with the fact that he, is trying to tilt the election in the way that he can in favor of the Republicans. But one thing that I think is always missing from this debate, and even in like just this morning, I was reading this explainer from NBC News, which kind of explains like what are the actual legal limitations. When people talk about shut down the border, what does that really mean? In the case of this proposed bill, it would mean that if a certain amount of encounters, which is such a inaccurate framing of the discussion, because an encounter is one thing, right? Let me just do an aside. The reason there are so many encounters with Border Patrol by migrants in the U.S. southern border is because U.S. asylum law is very clear. Anybody on U.S. soil can request asylum. So people cross irregularly. They don't cross at the legal ports or points of entry because they get thrown back. But if they cross irregularly, that is to say, if they cross where there's a gap in the fence or they climb over or the coyote crosses them, once they get and they have an encounter with the Border Patrol, they declare that they like to seek asylum. And that means that they have to be able to do that. And so that's why you see such an increase in encounters. But anyway, so there's an increase in encounters happening at the U.S. southern border for all the reasons I explained. There's all kinds of like legal reasons of that in terms of like who you can turn away and who you have to take and how it is that they came in. Anyway, lots of detail there. But one thing that never seems to come up is Mexican sovereignty, which we just finished talking about. It's weird. Like they think that you can just close the border and throw them back into Mexico. That actually doesn't comply with international law. You can't just send them back to where they came from in the way that some of the Republicans think, or at least are pretending that they think is possible. Whatever happens has to be the result of a negotiation. Now, in other instances, the federal government has agreed to take certain migrant populations back. For example, Haitians and Cubans and Venezuelans. I think Mexico, I'd have to check so don't quote me on that, but there are certain circumstances where Mexico has agreed. But here's the thing, right? Like, again, we're talking about a government that is led by a party that places high value in sovereignty. So if even if Republicans think that they're just going to get elected and shut down the border, they have to negotiate with Mexico, right? There has to be an actual agreement. And Mexico very much can be like, we're not going to do this. What's more likely is that they're going to deal, right? And one of the things that López Obrador has been trying to push for is it's sometimes called the Marshall Plan for Central America, a mass investment in the communities of origin of countries, which is so that people don't migrate in the first place. That's kind of López Obrador's philosophy, which is like people should only migrate because they want to, not because they have to. And people are migrating because they have to. So what are the reasons they are? Well, a lot of it is U.S. imperialism, right? There's a really good report by Migrant Roots Media, if people want to Google them. They published something in 2021, which kind of does a breakdown of Biden's plan for Central America. And it's more the same, right? That's the problem, is that much of what they propose to be the solution to the root causes of migration, in the case of Central America specifically, are just more neoliberalism, right? They're like, we just need more investment. Like, let's just get, what's that t-shirt company? Galvin? Let's get Galvin to make more t-shirts in Honduras, as if that's going to be what keeps people from wanting to leave. But he's also been really clear. Lift the sanctions, lift the blockade on Cuba, and the sanctions against Nicaragua and Venezuela, and you will see. And he's absolutely right. Again, I do a lot of work. I live where there's a lot of migrants on every day. I think there's something about my face that people always ask me for directions. I don't know. It happens every single time I leave the house. But I end up having a conversation with people. I'm like, oh, I'm heading that direction. Let's chat, because I take advantage of the opportunity. And without fail, now it's anecdotal, so I can't statistically prove it. But in my experience, all of the Venezuelan migrants I meet say the same thing. As soon as things get better in my country, I'm going to go back. right? And why are things bad in Venezuela? Because of the US-led economic blockade of that country, right? And so I think it's actually really important when López Obrador gets on his podium and says, end the sanctions on Venezuela, lift the blockade on Cuba, end the sanctions against Nicaragua, because those are the driving forces. And it's true. It's like you just have to kind of follow the patterns. Before it was Venezuelans, it was Hondurans. And why were Hondurans fleeing? Because they had a narco government that was backed by the United States under Juan Orlando Hernandez. And so that kind of like the pressure, that independent foreign policy that I spoke of earlier is really important when we think about actually attending to the root causes. But the other thing is also like, so not these neoliberal schemes of like foreign investment in these countries. No, state-led schemes, right? Build people's communities so that they have opportunities where they are, right? And he's a really big proponent of kind of replicating the Sembrando Vida program of, find a way, and if it takes direct cash transfer programs to get people to stay in their communities, let's do that. So anyway, well in there.
That was great. Thank you. Thank you, Jose Luis. I'm gonna actually jump back to some of the questions that were in the chats, and then I've got some more if it makes sense to go back to those. But Peter was asking earlier if you could talk a little bit about what led to the U.S. Canada Mexico agreement. Like, what was the process behind that, and how would you assess it?
So that was led by Trump. There is a provision in NAFTA that allows any country of the three to just say, hey, we need to renegotiate it or to outright cancel it. And so when Trump gets elected, and he has a curious economic policy, I'm not an expert on that, so I won't get into it, but there is almost parts of him that don't like free trade, which is kind of a consensus that even in the Democratic Party exists. But anyway, so he proposes that, and then renegotiation happens. But it happens under Peña Nieto. However, because López Obrador wins the election in the summer of 2018, he actually gets to send people from his team to the negotiation. So it wasn't just Peña Nieto, because there was at least an acknowledgement that a different government's going to come in, and if they are unhappy with the final agreement, they're going to trigger their right to renegotiate. And it took us so long to get here, we don't want to mess that up. So his negotiators end up actually participating in that. There's a lot of things. It's hard to know exactly which part López Obrador's team was responsible for, but there's one that we know in particular that he was, because he said as much. They actually inserted a clause. I don't know off the top of my head what number it is, but there's a clause now that explicitly says in the free trade agreement, Mexico has the inalienable right to modify its laws and its constitution to protect its natural resources, oil in particular, as a national good. I get the language wrong because I'm doing off of memory, but basically it says we have the right to a sovereign state monopoly in oil, which is interesting because that's in a free trade agreement. Like that's never seen before, that kind of language, right? So the new agreement has that, and there's like again, it's hard to know which one is directly the López negotiators are responsible for. But I always highlight that one because in one of the speeches he talked about how his team was the one that put that in there, but also because it speaks to his economic vision, his economic policy. What can we do with these free trade agreements, which are very much born out of that kind of thinking of reducing barriers to trade, improving the flow of capital, the flow of goods, et cetera, to in a way that is more beneficial. And I think it's important to also remember the labor reforms, the fact that this is a labor-friendly government, because right now there's a lot of talk about nearshoring, right? This idea of de-risking production by moving it out of China, et cetera, with increasing shipping costs. There's a million reasons why. So obviously one of the places that they're looking to is Mexico. And the idea is, for example, there's also the development of the Trans-Isthmus corridor. So it's going to be like a special economic zone along the lines of the rail. But the idea is that, so yes, they will be export-minded production facilities, but that they actually provide good wages, good income, reasonable hours, workers' protection, democratic unions. So it's kind of like, what if we could do things a little bit better in terms of actually delivering quality of life improvements to people in these communities. Now, it's hard to say exactly, for example, in these communities, if there is, what is the level of support for this? But I do think that generally we're
just gonna give it a moment, folks. We got some airport interference, but should be clearing in a minute.
Okay. Announcement over. So I kind of lost my train of thought, but anyway, all that to say is that of a different kind of conception, and that there is a lot of support in these communities for these kinds of projects. Now, we think about, for example, the Tren Maya as well, which is very controversial. Maybe we have some time to get into it, but I will say this: the Mexico southern states, so Oaxaca, Chiapas, Guerrero, they're the poorest. They've always been the poorest. And they also happen to be where there's the most representation of Afro-Mexicans and indigenous peoples. Gee, what a coincidence, right? Anyway, they've been the most neglected parts of the country. And that also includes the Yucatan Peninsula. So for the first time ever in Mexico's history, modern history, these parts of the country are the ones that have seen the greatest growth in gross domestic product, the greatest growth in jobs, the greatest reduction of inequality. So that tells you that these policies are having actual concrete results for these communities. So I think if you speak to many people who live in these communities, they would tell you that they are happy to see these kinds of investments happening in their states and in their communities. That's not to say that there isn't opposition, because there really is. And it's a very well-organized opposition. It's a very militant opposition that has a very different vision in terms of what they would like to see for their communities, that would kind of reject developmentalist thinking and the like. Nonetheless, I do think that we shouldn't make the mistake of thinking that just because there are very loud voices, legitimate voices criticizing these projects, that doesn't mean that they're wholesale rejected by these communities. In fact, arguably, most people support these policies.
Thank you so much. We've got quite a few questions, actually, so I'm going to try to go through some of these. Luke actually had questions around lawmaking in Mexico. So I'm going to try to shorten some of this, if that's okay. How are laws passed in Mexico compared to the United States? How many hoops does a law have to jump through to get passed? Yeah, also, how is the Constitution changed in Mexico? Here in the US, it's all but impossible.
Okay, I'm going to do a try to answer questions a little bit more rapid fire. So actually, Mexico's system is very similar to the United States, and there's a bicameral legislature. There's a division of powers and all this kind of stuff. To change the Constitution, you have to have a supermajority in both houses of Congress, and then you actually have to get a majority of states to also agree. The thing is, Morena has really expanded in terms of its presence throughout the country, and they control many, many states. They actually already have the state governorship in 22 of 32 federal entities, so the states plus Mexico City. So it's actually relatively easy as long as they're able to negotiate it at the federal Congress with opposition parties to actually be able to change the Constitution, because they know if they send it down to the state legislatures, they're going to approve it because they're controlled by Morena. So it's actually, there's been all kinds of reforms. I spoke about the direct cash transfer programs, social programs for seniors. Those are now constitutionally guaranteed, and that's a result of a reform that was promoted. López Obrador is on the last few months of his government. He's out in September, end of September. And right now he's doing a push to make all kinds of constitutional reforms as like kind of a last hurrah of his government. So, and there's a lot of expectation that they will be approved. But again, it goes back to what I was speaking to earlier, which is that the stakes are, can we win a supermajority in the Congress so that we don't need to negotiate with the opposition? Because the opposition ends up using that veto power it has to kind of extract things out of the government itself, or they use the block. Because we're in an election year, because we're in a moment where they're trying to do a lot of political brinksmanship, there actually hasn't been a lot of progress when it comes to laws and constitutional reforms. So that's also why you're seeing this push from Morena and the Morena party leadership to try to win that supermajority.
That was great. Thank you. So we got another question from Lucy Aguilar Navarro. What about eBrand running against Claudia Scheinbaum?
Yeah, so Morena went through a process to select its next candidate. Um, so we don't have primaries. In fact, that's a good thing, because if we had primaries, it's about who can mobilize enough votes, and that usually turns into who has the most money. So what ended up deciding, well, the process that Morena used was a series of opinion polls. So whoever wins the opinion poll became the candidate. And in fact, each candidate, there was a handful of them, but there was really three leading ones. So there was Marcelo Ebrard, Claudia Sheinbaum, and Adán Augusto López. So Adán Augusto López, in a lot of ways, was kind of the middle of the road candidate. He represented continuity, more of López Obrador. Marcelo Ebrard kind of represented a pivot to the right, a pivot to the center. Right, tried to appeal to the professional middle class, to appeal to urbanites more so than this government has tried. And then Claudia Sheinbaum kind of represented the left position. Now there was also Noroña, who's very popular in Mexican community abroad, but he didn't really have a realistic chance of winning, to be honest. And so it kind of boiled down to that. And the thing that I always talk about when I talk about this succession process is, so I think about Ecuador, and I know that sounds kind of weird, but you have Rafael Correa, who governs in Ecuador successfully, wins really strong mandates, et cetera, but he decides not to run again in 2016. And so the movement was kind of weak. There had been a bunch of right-wing protests at the time, and they weren't feeling confident as a movement at the time. And they end up picking Lenin Moreno as their candidate. And Lenin Moreno turns out to be a huge traitor. And that's no exaggeration. He jails his vice president, who was seen as closer to Correa. He splits the party in two. He starts making pacts with the old political parties, and he basically destroys the movement, right? Like Ecuador today is like the Ecuadorian parliamentary left is still trying to recover from that mistake, from having chosen the wrong person as the candidate. And they did it because they weren't feeling confident, because they thought they had to make that pivot to the center to win the election. Maybe they're right. I don't know. And at the end of the day, the end result was really bad. That's not the case in Mexico. That's not what happened in Mexico. In Mexico, the Morena feels invigorated. It feels confident. It keeps winning state governorships. There's I don't know the top of my head, but there was maybe 3 recent governor races since the election of López Obrador that Morena didn't win. So they feel really good. And when you're in that position, who do you choose as your candidate? The one that best represents your values. So Claudia Sheinbaum wins the candidacy through the opinion poll process. I think a lot of reasons because she best represents what Morena is all about, right? She is, like I explained earlier, right? She's a woman of the left. She comes from the social movement. She's an environmentalist. She has a doctorate. She's really intelligent. She governed Mexico City well. There's a couple of really bad incidents, some really kind of black marks on her administration. Like there was a collapse of a bridge that carried the subway car and a bunch of people died. I mean, that was pretty terrible. But aside from kind of those instances, she did a really good job. I always talk about how it's really, really awesome to live in a city that's governed by the left. Like subway fare is cheap. There's all kinds of free events happening all the time. There's all kinds of social programs. She opened up over 300 youth-centered, development, community development places, right? They're called pilares, where people can go and take classes for totally free, use a computer, kind of like a library, like the community development side of libraries here in the United States, right? 300 of them in the city. She built 15 parks, right? Whereas the previous government had only built 1, and it was in the richest part of town. Really things that change life. I don't live there anymore, but for a long time I talk about how I would go to class, I'd ride the subway, and usually before they built this new infrastructure, I'd have to ride like this awful packed, uncomfortable bus to make it home. And she built the cable cars. And so instead of that, I was had this nice, pleasant glide above the city. You know what I mean? And it sounds kind of silly, but those are the quality of life things. I knew that I could walk 10 feet out my home, board the cable car or the gondola. Sorry, that's what it's called. The gondola station. And in 5 minutes, I'm at the subway. And then in the subway system, I can be anywhere in a matter of half an hour, right? Those are the kinds of things that really improve people's lives, and they're really noticeable. And so she often also uses like a rights-based discourse, which I talked about earlier. That's I like that. You know what I mean? Like talking about una ciudad de derecho, the city of rights, where you know what, this isn't like a concession. This isn't, oh, the goodwill of our government. No, these are your rights. You're entitled to this. The Constitution says so. Our international agreements say so. And that's the way that she operates. And if that's the way she's going to govern, I think we're set.
That's awesome. And I just want to echo two statements that were made by Ed in the chat. Man, I'm so inspired. I really want her to run for as a US president too. I think one thing I've really appreciated that I've heard you, I mean, you said it today and I've heard you say it in other talks. You know, if it's possible in Mexico, it's possible here. And like to really use this as a moment of inspiration for our work here. So there was a question on, let me just quick check on this because there's a question on that ties back to US imperialism, and that opens up to a lot that I definitely wanted to hear you talk on. But before that, actually, I'm gonna jump to Betty's because I think this is very relevant to what you were just saying, and I don't want to lose this thread. So Betty says, in order to pay for all the improvements for people's lives, did the AMLO government change tax laws, tax the wealthy? What happened here?
I love that question because the surprising answer is no. He did not raise taxes, but he started collecting taxes. And it sounds so silly, but that is what made the difference. And that's actually what's annoyed the bourgeoisie the most. So in Mexico, because of that closeness of economic and political power that existed before López Obrador, whenever tax season came around, they would just get their taxes written off, right? The tax collection authority would be like, well, we have to preserve jobs, and if we collect the taxes, then they're going to have to close down the factory or whatever it was, right? And so they would continually have their taxes written off. That changed under López Obrador. So he didn't raise taxes, but he started charging the actual taxes that are due. And to show that it's not just talk, so there's this member of the Mexican bourgeoisie. His name is Ricardo Salinas Pliego, and he's the descendant of a long line of wealthy businessmen in Mexico. But he is the heir of these chain of stores called Electra. Electra they charge usury rates basically to sell you goods. So they're like, oh, pay on installments, but they're really, really high interest rates. He also has a bank called Banco Azteca. Anyway, so he has these businesses, and he says he's a libertarian, but he's kind of a libertarian to the degree that he wants the state to help him and not the poor. But anyway, he is one of the biggest thorn in the sides of the López Obrador government. Like he openly agitates against it, and he's constantly criticizing them. He's really irreverent. He's kind of a troll on Twitter, and it's because he's mad that he has to pay taxes. And it shows that this is a situation of class conflict, right? Like he's like, I'm rich and wealthy. Why am I paying taxes? That's for the plebes to pay, right? And so it's a good example of how how he's tried to be creative in terms of like to try to improve tax collection. It has worked, right? The OECD, Mexico is a member of, tracks like how good are you at collecting taxes. And under López Obrador, there's been a dramatic improvement of tax collection. But in order to pay for other things, it's also like the control of the resources, the control over the oil industry. Oil is still a really important commodity in the world, even though we need to move to a post-fossil fuel world. But until that happens, right, like that wealth is actually concentrated in the hands of the state oil company, which then pays the state to be able to fund things. But even projecting to the future, right, we all know that lithium is a really key mineral resource. It will be playing a more and more important role moving forward. The resources of lithium in Mexico were nationalized under López Obrador in 2022. So they are now belong to the state, and anybody who's interested in extracting that has to reach an agreement with the state-owned lithium company called Litio MX to actually enjoy and to be able to do that. Now, it's not really a developed industry in Mexico yet. Like it was just starting to take off. Most lithium comes from other places, but they're going to have to eventually start looking for that here in Mexico. The most important thing is that make sure that the rights of indigenous communities where this lithium may be located, if it's located in their territories, that their rights are respected. Those are really important things that, you know, can't be just kind of brushed away. Where are the practices going to be environmentally damaging, et cetera, et cetera? There's still a lot of work to be done, but I think big picture, we're looking at the right decision being made, which is that this should be in the hands of the state to pay for everything, to redistribute the wealth.
That was awesome. Thank you so much for addressing all that. And yeah, I'm really happy you spoke to just the new nationalization stuff that he's been doing. It's really freaking cool. I'm gonna jump to a question that someone from the library had, and then definitely taking more questions from the audience. But I have some follow-up ones to this, just because I think it opens up a really important topic. So they say Mexico has sued U.S. Gun manufacturers that are responsible for so many of the guns used in violence in Mexico. What do you think of the strategy to address the causes of violence and also U.S. imperialism?
I think I'll be honest with you. That's not one of my areas of specialty. I don't know. It's very complicated. There's a lot of actors when we think about the security situation. There's a lot of players. Um, Andy hosted a fantastic event a couple of weeks ago, and I think it's important to remember that one of the things that came out of that is that they analyzed this book, and the title says it all. Cartels don't exist. They don't, right? Like, it's not a real thing. A cartel is a very specific thing that is designed to basically, like OPEC. OPEC is a cartel, the oil producing exporting countries. That is designed to kind of keep a floor of prices and all this kind of. They make an agreement, or we'll cut production, all this kind of stuff. That's not how drug operations work anywhere in the world. In fact, they're very competitive. It's actually that competition that produces the violence, right? And the problem is I think it's really, when we're thinking about the security situation, is the solution will never come from Mexico exclusively. The solution requires action on the other side, on the demand side, right? As long as there's demand, as long as it is illegal, as long as it's pushed into the underworld, into criminal enterprises, you're going to have this kind of level of violence, right? It used to be in Colombia. It's now improved, but since 2006, for a lot of specific reasons, to the way that the war on cartels played out, one of the things we say in Mexico is that it wasn't a war against cartels, it's a war between cartels, and the state was very much intervening in favor of one over the rest of them to try to consolidate their position so that they would be kind of the only cartel. It's not even, I shouldn't be using that term. Organized crime group is actually the more accurate term. And so until that is managed, I don't know how much better the situation can get. But there's other factors, which is that the hyper violence that you see in Mexico is a result of all of the weapons that are available. People don't realize this, but there's actually only one legal gun store in all of Mexico, and it's in Mexico City. But somehow there are millions of guns in the hands of people in this country. Where do you think you're getting them? From the US. They're actually being smuggled in from north to south. People often talk about, oh, all the smuggling that's happening from Mexico. What about the other direction? And so one of the strategies has been to sue gun manufacturers, because the truth is, now a court has to the one to be determinate, but I don't think I'm going out on a limb here. They engage in policies that make it easy to get guns and easy to smuggle. Excuse me. If there was more mitigation efforts to actually control the flow of guns, we would probably see less violence here. The other thing is also, I don't think it's my place to tell policymakers or people in the United States what to do. I think it's important to respect that, because that's what I would expect of my comrades there. But it is obviously disappointing that this is treated as a criminal issue in this country, in the United States, as opposed to a public health issue. And on that note, I'll talk a little bit about fentanyl. This is a major issue in the bilateral relationship now. The flow of fentanyl from Mexico into the United States.
This is a final board announcement.
Just a moment, folks. We'll be back in just a second.
Okay, there we go. Fentanyl is a major issue in the bilateral relationship between Mexico and the United States. It wasn't before. And here's why. Fentanyl and its precursors used to come directly from China, mostly. But then the US federal government got into negotiations with the Chinese government, and they came to an agreement to control the flow of fentanyl and its precursors from China to the United States. So basically, it became controlled. It became a controlled substance, became regulated. But the demand is still there, right? The demand inside the United States for the consumption of synthetic opioids is still very much there. And so as long as that's there, people will figure out how to get it. And what did they figure out? Oh, we're going to flow it through Mexico, right? And in fact, it's not organized crime groups or sicarios or this idea that, you know, these narcos television shows make us think. It's actually US citizens that smuggle it in. On like so much commerce, there's so much movement across the border that there is no hope in hell to catch all of it. So it's going to keep flowing until there's an effort to address the actual demand for this, right? To figure out how to attend to this from a holistic public health perspective. Given the conditions in the United States when it comes to that, I do think that that's difficult to see. But the important thing is also that it doesn't lead to these outlandish proposals. I always talk about when this language, this talk of invading or bombing the drug labs, it first came out in Mark Esper's memoir about his time in the White House. He talked about how Trump was like, he tells them, well, why don't we just bomb them? They won't know it was us anyway. And that's, you know, Trump's solution to the fentanyl problem. Of course, Esper writes that he's like, he couldn't tell if he was joking or not. He clearly wasn't. And I remember at the time, you can look it up now, in the New York Times article, it's treated as this ludicrous fringe idea that nobody should ever take seriously. Fast forward to today, and that is the consensus position in the Republican Party, that we should bomb the cartels, and some people even talking about boots on the ground and invading Mexico in order to stop the flow of fentanyl, as if that would actually even solve it if they did do that. The point is that even when we're talking about the migration issue, right? There's this idea in most circles in Washington, inside the Beltway, in many the prominent political voices in the United States, that you can just trample over your southern neighbor's sovereignty. That's not actually going to happen. And it's most certainly not going to happen with a government led by López Obrador or Claudia Sheinbaum, right? It's not going to be like that. You're going to see resistance. You know, there was a think tank, Trump's think tank, I think it's called Restoring America or something like that. And they published a policy paper about what would it look like? What would the actual unilateral military action against Mexico look like? And they always talk about, no, we would negotiate first with Mexico. You will never get Sheinbaum or López Obrador to agree to allow US drones to fly over our country and bomb our cities. That's not going to happen. And that's another thing about international solidarity work, and some of the things that I talk about on this tour, is that if this idea, and the reason it scares me because it went from fringe to mainstream incredibly quickly, could go from proposal to reality very quickly. If this starts to really actually become part of the conversation, we have to push back immediately. We cannot allow that, right? We have to say, absolutely not. I did a speaking tour in the East Coast, and I was talking about this. And this young trade unionist guy who happened to be in town, and he came to my talk and all that. He didn't know a thing about Mexico. He wasn't even planning on, you know, hearing or learning about Mexico during his visit I was in Lynn, Massachusetts. You know, I gave my whole spiel, and he says, man, if they bomb them, you better believe we're not going to let them fucking get away with it. You know, and that's the attitude. We're not going to let you get away with it. That's what we need, right? And that's also not just because I think, especially with genocide happening in Palestine, we have to think a lot about what does solidarity mean? What does that actually translate? It's not just about like, hey, I reject what's happening right now in Palestine because I would hate for that to happen to me. I mean, yes, but that's not really why we do things, right? It's a shared humanity. Like, if the roles were reversed, I would be the first one trying to resist to make sure that innocent lives in the United States aren't being lost to these absolutely ludicrous policy proposals. right? And I say that because I make this joke all the time. It's not like the cartels have billboards on top of their buildings. We make drugs. The drug lab is here, right? They start actually doing this. Forget boots on the ground. Let's say that doesn't happen because that's a more complicated proposal to get approved in the United States. Let's say they say, we'll just drone strike, like as if that's not as severe. Like, do you know how many lives are going to be lost? Like, do you think that they're going to be so precise? They never hit their targets anyway. How many, how many other inventors using drones have they engaged in? I remember the incidents where they bombed a school bus full of people who were coming from a wedding. You know what I mean? Like that kind of thing happening on your own continent, on your doorstep. I don't think any working class person in the United States wants to see that either. And I think it's really important for us to understand those are the stakes. Those are the stakes. And I hope that people understand the seriousness of it because I think a lot of people are being convinced, right? You hear this talk about the invasion. Oh, we're being invaded. And that makes people kind of view things in a very bellicose way to say that if we're being invaded, then we should be allowed to strike back. That's such dangerous thinking, and nobody's going to win for this.
Just a moment, folks. We'll have Jose Luis right back in just a second.
Next question.
Well, I did want to say that I really appreciate you speaking to this. I know that for myself personally, I had kind of heard of talks of invasion in the periphery. I think I heard like Code Pink mention it a few times, but I didn't really think it was that serious until I started to actually look into just learn more about Mexico and US-Mexican relations and started to hear more of like, because if you're in right-wing circles, I feel like that's all you hear, but if you're in the left, you're not as much keyed into like how serious it is. So it really helps hearing you speak to one, how serious of a threat this really is, and two, like what would this look like? I mean, I don't think we think of drone strikes or bombings, but that is a very real thing given what they are saying. I have a question connected to this, and then we've got a few other good ones, but I did want to know, what can we do here with regard to the threat of like US imperialism directed at Mexico?
So I've been talking so long that my headphones ran out of battery. Can you still hear me okay? Okay. So I think the answer to that question would be the answer to any question in terms of what we can do. It's this. It's thank you for being here. This is the first step. It's learning about what's happening. It's signing up for the bulletin. The thing about the bulletin, the reason we promote it so much, one is it's bilingual, so it's available in English and Spanish. We do make the effort to make sure that everything that we're producing for the bulletin is available in both English and Spanish to make it as accessible as possible. But also because there's a lot of stuff that's being produced, that's written about Mexico that doesn't make it to most people's inbox or eyes or eyeballs or whatever you want to say. And so we try to bring, articles that we think are interesting, interviews with people who are involved with this kind of stuff. You can take inspiration from that. You have columns, we have several columnists. I'm not the only one. You people giving their own analysis, really, really brilliant people. So there's just different ways of making information available to you. So that's another thing that we've been thinking about. So one of our columnists is Kurt Hackbarth. He writes about Mexico for Jacobin. So he and I got together and we're doing a podcast now. I know that's what everybody does, but hey, there's got to be a reason for it, right? People are listening to it. So we just started a podcast called Soberanía, the Mexican Politics Podcast. And basically what we try to do is explain the country, things about what's happening here, answering the false narrative, answering the lies. I saw in the chat that somebody talked about the ProPublica article, trying to link López Obrador to organized crime groups. We did our last episode. We recorded about that, just kind of like making sure that really breaking it down and like, this is what's wrong. And this kind of, framing is totally off base. Just as an aside, like this whole thing is built around this notion that López Obrador would sell out his security policy for $2 million. It doesn't even make sense on the surface, right? Like that's petty cash to organized crime groups. Why would a politician sell out his soul for $2 million. Like, it doesn't even make sense on the surface of it. And I think it's actually kind of racist to think that our price is so low. Anyway, I find it insulting. Anyway, that's one thing. Getting more involved. One of the things that we've been thinking about doing is finding different ways at different degrees of involvement that people can be engaged with. So yes, holding webinars. So we want to do one once a month where we can bring in different speakers and can learn about different things and ask all the kind of questions that we want. There's so many brilliant people thinking and writing and producing material about Mexico. We want to bring them to you in person through the speaking tour. That's one thing. Like I said, so we have the podcast. We also started a new website called Mexico Solidarity Media. Like I said, it's like Venezuela Analysis, but for Mexico, getting involved. One thing that we're also putting out there is maybe trying to tap people to take a leadership role on Mexico Solidarity efforts, right? To build local committees, local organizations that can be engaged with this kind of work. And then the final thing would be come visit us, come to Mexico. You know, often we think about what's happening in Latin America, and it can seem really far away, right? I remember the first time I went to Venezuela, I was like, ooh, Venezuela, how do you even get there? Right? Like, how many layovers are there going to be? And there was a lot, right? Mexico isn't that far, right? There's all kinds of direct flights from all over the United States. So one of the things we're organizing is an actual visit. It's so the end of May, beginning of June, to coincide with the elections. Come visit Mexico, meet some of the people who are involved, who are doing all kinds of amazing work. There's some, like the candidate for mayor of Mexico City for Morena is Clara Brugada. The projects that she's done in Iztapalapa, which is one of the poorest, largest boroughs of Mexico City, it's extraordinary, right? She built these, I think there's 13 now. They're called utopias, which is like, I love even the name of it, right? Like, I think, you know, it's we're the ones who talk about that utopian vision. It's the left. It belongs to us. They're kind of like they're public spaces, but they also have public programming. Each one kind of has like a theme. Like one has like a dinosaur park, the other one is shaped like a boat, and it's like it's pretty cool, right? Like this is what it looks like when you have that public investment. And in fact, one of the key things I like talking about that is that I think resonates with people in the United States is we talk a lot about public investment and public services. So in Mexico, most public works projects are done by subcontractors, right? They're bid. So people issue bids and they build it. And in the case of Iztapalapa, everyone's like, well, of course, Iztapalapa, you know, I'm sure they funneled all kinds of millions of pesos down to that part. It's not true. Their budget was the same as always. But you know what the difference was? She used public workers to do everything, right? Like, there's more of the things that shows proof, like, let's stop privatizing our services, because when we keep them public, we're able to do more with that money, right? That's just one example. So to invite people to come down, I know that it's getting close, so we're going to sign up for the bulletin, because that's where the information is going to come out in terms of this is when the delegation is happening. This is how much it's going to cost. We're going to try to make it as accessible as possible as well. I understand not everybody can come for a week. Maybe people can only come for 4 days. Well, we'll make it work, right? So you can be there for the 4 days and come down. So someone's asking for the trait. Okay, so what I'm thinking is, let me open the calendar. Election is June 2nd, which is a Sunday. And so that means that it would be great if you could be here basically that weekend. So if you have a really limited schedule, can you be here from May 30th to June 3rd? But if you have more time, come a week ahead. Come May 26th and stay until June 4th, right? I think it's really important that you stick around for the end, because so I mentioned I was part of the election observation mission in 2018. And one of the key things that we were watching out for is that if there was a fraud, that we'd be able to denounce it immediately. So if there is an effort to undermine the legitimacy in this case, we've already seen it. Xochitl Galvez, the opposition presidential candidate, is actually in the U.S. right now. She was in New York and she's in D.C. and she's meeting with think tanks and meeting with like the America Society and those kinds of right-wing groups. And she's meeting with the OAS, and she's specifically going to request them to send an election observation mission to Mexico, because they want to try to construct this narrative that the election result will be illegitimate. And if that does happen, we know the OAS is capable of it, because that's what they did in Bolivia. And that's what led to the coup against Evo Morales, to try to lie to the world and say that it's not a free and fair election in order to delegitimize the mandate of Claudia Sheinbaum. It would be great if we had people like yourselves who are involved in community organizations, who are involved with their trade unions or whatever it is, even if you aren't, to be here to be like, actually, that's not true. I was part of that. I was there. What they're talking about is part of a narrative to promote a coup against the legitimate will of expression of the Mexican population. And even things like talking to your representatives and be like, asking for that meeting and be like, hey, I was there and what they're saying isn't true. You better not vote for sanctions against Mexico, or whatever it turns into, right? Writing a letter to the editor when the news station in the morning is talking about the issue, calling in and being like, that's not true. I was there, or my neighbor was there and he told me all about it, right? I think, finding all the different means for us to effectively intervene and protect the will of the Mexican voters, protect Mexican sovereignty, and help defend this project.
That was brilliant. Thank you, Jose Luis. And that's a beautiful way to, we're coming in at the last 10 minutes. It's a beautiful way to tie things in. I'm hoping we can, I'm hoping we can get a link in so that way Ed can know like when to buy the ticket for, and you said the Mexico Solidarity Bulletin would be a good access point. So we'll go ahead and get that link in just a minute. I also want to put a plug in again thank you for putting that in. That's perfect, Jose Luis. So please subscribe to the bulletin. You'll see ways to be able to get connected for this trip and to be involved in everything Jose Luis has talked about. One thing I really want to emphasize that I've really appreciated about Jose Luis's work in this tour and Mexico Solidarity Project in what they've been pushing for. So they've been coordinating with the International Committee of Democratic Socialists of America. We're helping with the East Bay. Well, right now it's virtual, but like for the Bay Area portion, we got a San Francisco event coming up tomorrow. But one thing that Mexico Solidarity Project and Jose Luis have been pushing for is really getting connections to happen locally with just our socialist leftist groups, with those who are doing work in Mexico Solidarity, and trying to really build on those connections, so that way that we can just really continue this work further. So I'm very grateful for that. I do also want to just emphasize what Jose Luis was mentioning, the podcast earlier. It's brilliant. I'm going to go ahead and there's a link to it in the chat. Please check it out. If for those of you who may not have caught what he was talking about earlier, was the recent the leaks from the DEA about supposed money being sent to AMLO during his one of his presidential campaigns. Those drug money, just how absolutely absurd the claim is, and like how easily it falls apart when you start to like pick at the threads. I was going to ask for you to speak at that, but I don't know if it makes a lot of. Do you want to talk a little bit about it right now, or it's up to you? It's got about 7 minutes left.
I'll try to keep it brief because I think we're almost out of time here. But I think it's a really good example of the kind of intervention that is happening. It doesn't always happen directly. It usually isn't, the days of old where some kind of CIA plot is actually happening. Although I do think that there are very powerful intelligence individuals or assets being used in this particular case. But basically, so that there was, we called it the synchronized swim, nado sincronizado. So earlier this week, 3 outlets, Deutsche Welle, Inside Crime, and ProPublica, published virtually the same story, and based on the same allegations, which suggest that López Obrador's 2006 campaign was tainted by drug trafficking organizations secretly funding his campaign to the tune of $2 million. That it was through one of his closest aides, and the story has basically fallen apart since then. But the point of it was to establish that narrative, that this is a narco government, that it is a government that is anti-democratic, that is favoring the interests of organized crime groups, that, you'll see now all throughout social media, the hashtag narco presidente, or narco president. So that was the aim of it. It was a smear campaign. It was, the idea is to undermine public support in that. And it was really troubling to see, because it's a sign of things to come. It's a sign of the depths they're willing to go to try to promote a narrative that is convenient to the interests that run contrary to this political project that we spent 2 hours talking about, right? That try to weaken what's happening in terms of this country, to try to lessen the ability of people to sympathize with what's happening in this country. And so it's a really good example of, and I anticipate that more of these kinds of things are end up coming out. There's going to be more of these kinds of dirty tricks, we call them, right? Trying to craft a narrative, trying to smear the president, trying to label his party as illegitimate, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And wasn't the only one. Actually, our first episode of the podcast, episode 0, we called it, looked at that article that I was talking about from the Texas Observer, which is a progressive outlet, right? Like if you go to their news page, you'll see them taking, the right positions on Palestine, taking the right position on reproductive rights, et cetera, et cetera. Somebody was telling me that actually that paper was on the brink of bankruptcy and the community rallied to save it because they believed in it. To see themselves lend themselves to this, right? It's not a mistake that it's not a coincidence that it happened in an outlet like the Texas Observer, where somebody from the Baker Institute, a right-wing think tank, tries to launder their ideas through the press, trying to smear the president, smear Morena, smear this project. Because again, it goes back to what we were talking about throughout this presentation, which is also like the class interest, that there is a ruling class, there's a transnational bourgeoisie that doesn't like López Obrador, and doesn't like that he defends sovereignty and has an independent foreign policy and is taxing the rich and is actually collecting taxes, that is redistributing wealth, that says, no, we're not going to privatize. In fact, what we're going to do is nationalize our company, and we're going to redistribute the wealth through that, and we're going to implement universal social programs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right there, as an aside, right? For example, Mexico banned GMO corn, and in the United States issued a complaint in the International Tribunal saying that it's not a legitimate decision. Just to add at this point, oddly enough, you know who joined that complaint? Canada. And Canada does not sell corn to Mexico. There's no reason for them to be involved. Why do they do it though? It's a sign, right? It's like we're on the same side of the US ruling class that doesn't like this. And so you can see that they have that level of coordination. Fine, right? You can have your Davos. We have the Foro de Sao Paulo. We should be organized on that internationalist basis.
That was great. Thank you so much, Jose Luis. I'm going to go ahead and start wrapping up at this point. We've got about 3 minutes left. Please, if you have not signed in for this event, please make sure to do so. We want to be able to follow up and have this recording available for people. Our hope is that, but in order for us to do that, we do need to have your contact information. So I've posted again in the chat the sign-in sheet. Please be sure to sign in there. We are planning still, so far at least, there should be an event tomorrow night in San Francisco. I'm going to go ahead and post the link for that as well. And I want to echo Betty. Thank you so much, Jose Luis, for doing this talk. This has been great. Don't go yet. For those of you who are interested in the San Francisco event, I just want to make sure that you will have access to that if you want to come see Jose Luis live.
Oh, can I just say something? I
yes,
feel great. I feel really good about this. It was so nice. I could see people's faces following along, all the questions, the engagement. There was good turnout. I felt pretty bummed this morning when the flight kept getting delayed, and I was like, "Oh, am I gonna make it? I'm gonna make it." And ultimately, I didn't. For those of you who don't know, like I'm in the Portland airport right now, trying to make it to you. And in fact, we had boarded the plane, and I was like, "Oh, phew, we're gonna make it." And then they took us off the plane, and I was like, really, really sad. Because Andy especially has been so enthusiastic, and he's been to every organizing meeting and stuff. And I felt so bad that we weren't going to be able to meet in person. But I feel great now. It's been so good to connect with all of you. I'm really, really grateful for it. And I hope it's the beginning of a longer relationship, right? Like I'm just one person, right? It's not the Jose Luis Granados speaking tour. It's the Mexico Solidarity Project speaking tour. I think it's really important to highlight that. It's been great working with people like Andy, with the DSA. We did an event in Salem with somebody from the CPUSA, right? Like, we're not being sectarian about this, right? There's people from Liberation Road. There's all kinds of different socialist tendencies that are involved in all of this, that are part of the Mexico Solidarity Project. And I'm really glad that we were able to come together. And I just want to really express my heartfelt appreciation to all of you for being here. And I hope we'll be able to see each other and see again. And if we don't see each other on a tour or whatever, we'll see each other in Mexico City, because that's where I live. And hopefully some of you can come down for that delegation.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, this was absolutely incredible. Thank you so much for being flexible, Jose Luis, to jump in still with virtual. And hang out at an airport for I don't know how many hours you've been there now.
Since 6:30 in the morning.
Jesus
And
God.
I am gonna leave tonight. I do have a ticket for 7:30 tonight, so I should be eventually there.
Good, good. And let's chat outside here so that we can get everything lined up so we can get you connected. But yeah, please see the link again. I'm gonna post it one more time in here. This is for San Francisco tomorrow night. Should be a good talk. Every talk, as you can tell, things are happening. I'm sorry, these talks are each one unique, so I think that, like, you know, you're gonna hear something new and different each time, so please come check it out. We've got the San Francisco link in the chat. Just want to quick thank all of our co-sponsors. Thank you, Mexico Solidarity Project. Thank you to all of our DSA comrades for making this happen. Thank you, Liberation Road, for co-sponsoring. Thank you, UAW. And yeah, we're really looking forward to the SF leg and hope to see you all soon. Thanks again. See you later. Okay, let me